The following interview is with Sergeant Skeptic, a former law enforcement officer who is a proclaimed atheist agnostic. And him and I talked for over an hour concerning why he doesn't believe in God, why I do, what would convince him that God is real, and also miracles that have happened in my own life and his response to those. Enjoy. So, Dana, you are an atheist or agnostic. Like, how would you define, I guess, your belief system concerning God?
Yeah, okay, so that's a pretty good question. I guess my definition would be I don't believe that there's a God, but I've said this before, but I could be wrong. So I don't want to come off like there is no God. That's totally not possible, yada, yada, yada. But I do kind of, I'm a person who traditionally makes decisions and makes a decision. And so I don't think there's a God, is how I would. So there's like a little bit of agnosticism to it, but that's just how I consider myself an atheist, but I am also open to new information. And that, hey, you know what? I've been wrong about things in my life before, looking back at some of the ideas that I had in the past. And I go, well, I think I didn't get that one quite right. So that's how I would describe myself.
And you feel, and like, when did you kind of come to that maybe conclusion, or at least began to, have you always been in that place of maybe disbelief towards God, or were you raised believing in God and then some moment happened and you're just like, you know what, I don't think there's a God, and then it just continued that from there?
Yeah. So I think, I probably, so I grew up in a totally non-religious home. If you would have, talked to me when I was 21 years old, I would not have been able to tell you the story of Jesus in any way, shape, or form, with the exception of, if you believe in Jesus, then you go to heaven. And if you don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell. That at about the age of 21 was my complete and total understanding of Christianity. I would not have been able to explain the difference between a gospel and an epistle. I wouldn't have known who Paul was. I wouldn't have been able to say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so I was at square zero, as a young man.
Wow. So I wonder, I'm so curious with that. Like, that is interesting. Well, I guess now more and more people, many people are disbelieving in God and raising their children, at least not bringing them to church and whatnot. But I'm so curious about that, like if your upbringing was a little bit different. Mine was, I don't want to say completely similar, but Christianity was not the focus. My parents were not missionaries. People see me preaching sometimes. They're like, your parents were pastors, your parents were missionaries. I'm like, no, they weren't. My mom was a model. She was a famous model in Japan. My dad was like a fisherman, and they got married and had me, and they just kind of let me do my own thing.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's super interesting. So I'm very curious about that, like the upbringing. But even that, it didn't sound like, were your parents very like dogmatic, like, hey, there's no God, or were they kind of just like, yeah, we don't really believe in God. Do your own thing, Dana. Figure it out.
Yeah. Okay. So very good. My upbringing was not great. Was raised by a single mother. My father lived in Europe. Between the ages of, let's say, 5 and 50 years old, I may have seen my father about 50 times. So kind of just put that in perspective. So my mom was busy. She did attend the Unitarian Universalist Church, and I occasionally went as a child. And the only thing I remember about it is I liked the donuts after the service. And during the service, the kids all did like horticulture. So, I mean, it really wasn't church at all. And it was just not a topic of conversation one way or the other growing up. The very first exposure that I would have had to Christianity was as a teenager. This was kind of in the very mid 1970s, and the kind of the born again Christian movement is sort of starting in Southern California, where I was growing up. And so I'd heard about, some of my friends became born again Christians, and that would have been my very first exposure to it. But I never really pursued any of that. So, yeah, I didn't really have anything one way or the other. It was, I kind of naturally, as an American, I think it's cultural to believe in God. So if you would have asked me, at 10 years old to 15 years old, do you believe in God? I would say, well, yeah, but I wouldn't have had any idea as to why, or just kind of a
Or what
cultural
that even
experience.
entails.
Yeah, right,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you think about that when you have debates with people, like say with a Muslim or a Jew, or they say you're a Christian because you're raised like that, you're a Jew because you're raised like that, and I believe a lot of that, especially with Islam. I mean, I have not met. I mean, I went to university, UCF, like 60,000 students there, and
UCF,
you meet
that would
all
be,
different types of people
what would
in
UCF?
Orlando.
Okay.
And right now, it's the largest university. It was like, I think it might have been that time where it was starting to become the largest. But like you would meet, I meet Muslims, I meet Jews, and like all of them, specifically Muslim, well, Jews too, they were Jew or Muslim because their parents were. And I don't think I've ever met. I know, I'm sure there are. I know Andrew Tate. I know he kind of says that, like he became a Muslim. But you rarely see that. And then even with Jews, you rarely see that as well. But then I've noticed, like, and it may be because I'm a Christian, that I spend time with Christians, I'm in different churches and whatnot. It might be that, but I think there's something to it. I've encountered people of all different walks coming to Jesus, whether they were raised Muslim or raised Jew or raised atheist, raised Hindu, whatever, coming to Jesus. And I find that, I'm curious what you would think about this. For me, I don't say that's the end evidence of why, because there's cults out there, there's things that are not good that people of all walks of life join and are a part of. But that's one fascinating thing I've realized with Christianity, is seeing people of all walks of life, poor, rich, whatever it is, having this born again experience, coming to Jesus and giving their life to him. Yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts kind of on that as a line of evidence towards Christianity, with the potential of it being true.
Yeah, so I don't discount that. I think especially when you live in a country like the United States, where really you don't have to become a Christian if you don't want to. So the way I'm viewing this is, I think some younger people, kids and teenagers, are somewhat pressured by their particular culture where they're living, and their parents certainly. But by the time you get to be, an independent adult, this is an optional decision for people. Whereas, and I don't want to sound like I know much about Islam. I don't, but I don't think it's optional necessarily. I believe in Saudi Arabia, they even have police that literally enforce their religious laws, so it's completely different than our experience here in America. So, yes, I do think that, that Christianity being this worldwide religion, and there even being something in the book of Acts and in the gospel stories about it spreading throughout the world, that did happen. I don't discount it. But we're also taking a snapshot in time of 2025 where, Christianity might currently be the most popular religion in the world, but at the end of the day, most people are not Christians. And you might also have evidence that it's the world's fastest dwindling religion, and Islam is actually the fastest growing religion. But I don't want to come off as that those are facts, because I haven't really studied those issues particularly well. But yeah, I mean, Christian, Jesus died 2,000 years ago. We're still literally talking about him with a lot of passion today. And I don't think you should just wave that away as some kind of, non-evidence, especially when there are some stories in the New Testament that, hey, this is going to spread throughout the world. And it did. Now, that doesn't prove anything to me. But it is a piece of evidence, maybe a data point in favor. But then I go and I look at how Christianity spread. And it wasn't always voluntary. There was a system of carrots and sticks with the spread of Christianity. And if you, accepted the teachings of mostly the Catholic Church at the time, then you got the carrots. And if you didn't accept them, then you got the sticks. So, but yeah, I think it's an interesting point. It doesn't really have a huge impact one way or another for me personally. I'm looking at these gospel stories, the book of Acts and the Bible itself. And that's where I really move far away from Christianity as being a true thing. Yeah,
that's good. So what would you say are kind of the major off-putting factors say, of Christianity, following Jesus. And maybe I should be able to define it a little bit more. I believe there are a lot of professing Christians, people that profess Christianity. They've been going to church their whole life. They're cultural Christians, right? And they may even say they believe in the Bible and they believe in Jesus and whatnot. But in reality, they could easily become, if they were in a Muslim country, Muslim, Jew, whatever, they haven't had, like we discussed, that born again experience. They don't really know the Lord, I would say. And I'm not trying to judge or criticize them. It's just, that's the fact. I mean, when I was in high school, I said I was a Christian. I even asked my parents, I was like, people ask me what religion I am. What do I say? They said, say you're Methodist. I'm like, okay, I'm Methodist. And I was I was a partier in high school. I got arrested like right after graduation, like a few months later. I turned 18 and I was like, oh man, and that's a whole nother story there. But so yeah, I guess I don't want to. Again, I'm not trying to be critical or judgmental against those that profess Christianity, but I've learned that there's a difference between those that really, really love Jesus and they really are seeking to follow him with their lives, and then those that are like, yeah, I'm Christian, and they don't really know Jesus. They just kind of are traditional Christians.
Yeah, no, I accept that. It's kind of funny you mentioned asking your parents, what do I say? Tell them you're. So when I joined the Army, I was in the California Army National Guard. And when at those times you had to list your religion down because it was going to be on your dog tags. And I didn't know what to put. So I just put Catholic down because I'd heard that word before. And I do think that I was probably baptized Catholic. I don't know that I was aware of that when I filled out that military form, but that's what I put down. And I was just like, well, I don't know. I heard the word Catholic before, so I'll put that down. So I made that spontaneous decision. I did want to throw in a question, though. It's my view that most Christians, or certainly a good percentage, do have doubts about it. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually almost, when they express these doubts, I actually think that's a really honest opinion. But then there are other Christians who I really kind of believe they don't really have any doubts that this is true. And they have these personal experiences with Jesus. So that's interesting to me because I do consider that to be some evidence that potentially Christianity is true. These people who really, I know them well enough and I know they're honorable and honest people and they're not really exaggerating or making things up. And they're very convinced that this is true. And a lot of them do talk about personal experiences. Now, that doesn't convince me, but I consider it a piece of data point. What do you think about Christians who do have doubts, even maybe strong doubts? Not disbelief. That's a whole different thing, but just really doubts about it.
That's good. And I think, well, first let me mention that I think that's a good thing for people to be honest. I think there is a pressure, even probably amongst atheists or agnostic. It's like once you're in a label, in a category, it's almost like you can't, but for me personally, I remember the first big doubt I had was in middle school when I learned about the Big Bang. And I was like, oh, cause and effect. So I was like, well, I think at that point I was like, there's no free will, right? And that can be a whole nother discussion there. But I just learned very briefly about the Big Bang and cause and effect. I'm like, wow, well, maybe there's no God. It's just all science and this. And I wasn't even a big believer at that point. I didn't go to church regularly. I knew very little about the Bible. And then, but I always had some sort of belief. I'd pray at night. I would just say, now I lay me down to sleep, pray Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, pray Lord my soul. I would say that prayer, and God bless mommy, daddy, And then it wasn't until college and drugs had a lot to do with it, surprisingly. When I started smoking weed, it actually felt like it opened my mind in many ways, which I'm not telling anyone right now to smoke weed or do drugs, but for me personally, it helped, even though I just was just doing it. I don't recommend it, but it helped me to kind of open up and start looking at the world differently. And then fast forward, I'm in college, I'm in philosophy class, and I start dealing with all these big questions. It was a phenomenal philosophy class. The only thing, no tests, right? It was no assignments. It was just, you have to answer these 6 questions. What is good and bad? What happens after you die? Whatever. Just big questions just to make you think. There's no right answer, but it's just to make you think. And that really helped to launch me to begin to pursue, okay, what are these truths? And I remember one night I was wrestling with, what is good and bad. And all I know is that I had a powerful, I would say in that moment, encounter with God. I had done drugs before. I'd done drugs after that. And so I knew what it was like to be under the influence of very acid, shrooms, all these things. But in this moment, it felt as though a presence, an external agent was in my room, something that was beyond myself. And I remember just breaking down in tears because it felt like pure love, even though in the moment I was saying sorry. Like, it was like I felt the conviction. The Bible says, like, the kindness of God leads you to repentance. So it was so wild because you think like God coming and that, I'm sure that happens at times, but I didn't feel like God was like, you are a wicked sinner, Scooby, or Scooby's my nickname. Will, whatever, you're wicked, But I felt his love, but in the love, I began to see myself. I mean, I'm doing drugs, I'm sleeping around with girls, I'm living for myself. Mm-hmm. And I remember in that moment, I was like, I knew it was God, I just didn't know which God. And then I heard the name of Jesus begin to like resound in my chest. Super powerful, right? And I don't want to say that is the reason why I believe in God, but it definitely launched. So now fast forward, like, okay, doubts. So now I'm like, okay, God's real, in my opinion. And I begin to give myself to Jesus, reading the Bible and different things. I start going to church. And I remember certain days would be so hard. Like, I don't know, I would say it was spiritual. Maybe there's other mental influences. I'm not sure. If, like, thinking back, it felt spiritual. Like, I do believe in the demonic, and I believe in these evil entities that you can't see. And I know they don't want us to follow Jesus. But I remember certain days, it felt so hard to believe. Like, I would just look at the Bible and say, how can I believe this book? Like, how can I believe these pages? What if it was corrupted? Like, just these questions you have. And I remember those days were the hardest to remain pure in my mind too. Like, to keep my mind pure, because I was addicted for years to pornography. Completely addicted. Like, I couldn't go a few days. I never got addicted to drugs, but I was completely addicted to pornography and sexual vices and sin and stuff. And I remember those specific days, which I think there's a correlation, the doubt with the battle against sexual perversion was very high, And so for me, the greatest doubts I had was in my first year of really following, because I knew so little. I didn't do any research. Right. I mean, I was starting to do research. I didn't have enough research under my belt. Now, 10 plus years later, I've been able to study the history of the Bible and how manuscripts were developed, how they come down through the ages, how we can have reliability in the current Bible we have, different things like that, and other things I've learned. So, but that was doubts then. And then currently, I mean, I feel it's interesting. And stop me at any point if you have like another question, if you want to go deeper in any of those specific areas.
Yeah, okay. I don't really want to stop you. I made a couple of little notes, but then you said something else that's more interesting than my notes. I would add this, though, that, you talked about kind of Christian culture and atheist culture, that you go around telling people you're an atheist. They pigeonhole you in a way that I am not, generally very liberal, with all these things that come attached to it. And this is really one of the things that motivated me, because I don't fit that culture. Really, I don't want to say at all. I do fit it a little bit. But that was one of my motivations to say, I'm kind of like this I'm not saying I never smoked marijuana, but it was not part of my life ever. Drugs were never part of my life. Alcohol, I never abused alcohol, but I certainly have enjoyed it. I'm never arrested. I mean, if you looked at my background, it's pretty clean, pretty conservative, and not a lot of drama. And so, I felt like I almost have a responsibility, that there are people like me who are not Christians who have studied this issue. And I felt a responsibility to push back a little bit on professional apologists who I thought were telling things that are really not true, or at least debatable. And that, a person from, that I don't have some wild haircut, I don't have some crazy tattoos all over myself. I was in law enforcement, I spent some time in the military, a very milquetoast kind of guy who also doesn't believe in God. It was one of the reasons I wanted to be public about this, to maybe even offer support who people who are not believing, that there's other people out there that are like you that also don't believe. And I don't know, that was part of my motivation. Your story, though, I see you've had this personal experience with God, and I don't want to just discount this. I have not had that, so I can't use that for evidence for me that a God exists. But I don't want to just discount the wide number of people who have had these experiences, although I think this is actually an argument in favor of maybe polytheism is actually potentially true. This isn't an argument that Christianity is true. It's more, people are having a wide variety of experiences of some type of God, everywhere from the Native Americans to you to people in Islam say the same thing. Mormons are well known for saying personal experiences, knowing Joseph Smith was correct. So that maybe polytheism is actually what's true, that there's this wide variety of gods. Anyway, so I don't know, that was kind of a little bit, I was commenting on atheist culture that I don't really match with that. Felt there was a little bit of a responsibility for me to put myself out there. And that, your comments, I tried that. I tried praying. I was a church-going Christian. I don't want to say I was a church-going Christian. I was a church-going, very skeptical Christian for, a good 10 years, good solid 10 years. And that was one of the things I did try, Jesus, come into my heart, I really want to know you, this kind of thing. And I really got no reaction from that. I actually got the opposite reaction. I almost think if there is a God, he's somewhat motivating me to say Christianity is not true, because maybe this God is starting to get tired of false faiths and wants people out there to refute that. Anyway, I don't want to take over the interview, but those are just kind of my thoughts,
No, you're good. And it's interesting you brought that up, like God. It's an interesting thing. Like, the more I think, especially learning about science and quantum mechanics and consciousness and even learning about God more through even meditation and prayer and such, I'm realizing God, in my opinion, is so multifaceted. And he's looking at, because people say, why would God allow this to happen? And how could God allow this? And that's a very good question. But it's from our standpoint in time and space, we only see this little data point, but we don't see the effect of that and and different things and whatnot. But the one thing, the whole thing of the multiple gods and such, all of this I want to be open to. I think and that's why I would love to do more of these interviews, because I feel like my viewpoint is conservative, Orthodox Christianity, but I've learned to really allow myself to think past the dogma. Even my views on hell, I do believe in a hell. I believe in a judgment, but I'm also open to the fact that what if people their consciousness ends? It's hard. And again, I think this could help maybe certain atheists, because I could totally get it. My wife and I have these conversations, and people might think I'm a heretic for saying this. But I just think about eternal hell, forever suffering. I don't think we think about that. I think we, as Christians, we just kind of that's how it is. But then atheists and others, they think about that and whoa, you're telling me if I don't believe in Jesus, or someone from another country doesn't believe in Jesus, they're going to go to this place and they're going to be tortured forever. Their consciousness, they're going to be conscious of their torment forever, and they're going to be in that state from your loving God forever. Right? I'm assuming that's probably been a big thing, maybe a big turnoff for you, right? Hearing that teaching.
Yeah, so this would go back to teenage, teenagers talking, which, they're really not, teenagers are probably not the greatest source of information, but that was one thing that the teenagers who had become born again Christians were talking about. Oh, Jesus just loves everybody, but if you don't believe in him, you'll go to hell. And that did not match up in my very pragmatic, nuts and bolts kind of mind. but it wasn't also something that was really a part of my thought process at the time. But there was this little twinge of, that's kind of weird, loving but send you to hell. It doesn't jive. So I haven't really explored hell. I don't believe hell is an actual physical location. I don't believe in heaven. I think those are man-made constructs. So I don't really think much of them. In this world, it used to be back when I was first kind of exploring this, that, hell was a scary thing. I want to avoid that. I think this is, as in law enforcement. So you get very skeptical. You almost think that everything you hear is a lie until you investigate it thoroughly. But that's fraud to me. Like, we have this great reward if you believe something and invest in it. And if you don't, you have this horrible thing that's going to happen to you. That is the basis of every street fraud that's ever been done, is, great reward for taking this risk and terrible punishment for not. So that ultimately is a bit of a data point against Christianity, is that kind of basic plot doesn't really register as real to me, and more of a man-made construct.
Yeah, and that actually, as you're speaking, that reminds me back to my previous line that I was going, and then I got off with the hell part.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that was me, because I was like, because I would love to talk about that too, because I think even maybe atheists watching and hearing that certain viewpoint could potentially help, because I love how, like, children, and I'm kind of going to another one now, but children are so keen at finding contradiction. And I think for me personally, like, if this is true, there shouldn't be contradiction, right? With the loving God. But back to what I was saying, have you heard of Lee Strobel? Have you heard of his Case for Christ documentary?
Yeah, I've not studied Lee Strobel. I pronounce it Strobel, so I don't know.
I think you got it right. It'd been a habit of saying Strobel, but I think you have it better. Yeah.
Yeah. So of all those, Lee Strobel, J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, I consider they have a theme of apologetics, and of all those apologists, J. Warner Wallace would be the most not interesting to me, the one that I studied first because of his law enforcement career. We had something in common. He speaks the same language I speak. He says things that I understand because of our culture is similar. Both of us are from Southern California. So I'm more familiar with J. Warner Wallace. I actually really want to debate J. Warner Wallace, but he doesn't do debates. So that has not happened, but I think it would be really kind of cool. Two cops from Southern California, debating, is Christianity true or not? I've reached out to him numerous occasions, but I've decided that's not going to happen. And then I think Frank Turek is more of a scholarly version of that same genre. So I'm very familiar with, I think, I've never read Lee Strobel. I've studied other people, but I think I'm very well read on that kind of genre of Christian apologetics. I don't know where I was going with that, but I just wanted to explain. I know who Lee Strobel is, and I have a vision based on J. Warner Wallace and Frank Turek, what his arguments are likely to be. Although I've not read his books.
Yeah. And then with that, it's because he was an atheist. He's a pretty staunch, hardcore atheist. And he was a journalist, writer, and whatnot. And he explored Christianity and such. And he has a whole movie and documentary of his journey with that, and then coming to faith and everything. But I find I've learned more and more. I don't know why God does certain things, but it's of the belief that he's working everything towards good and the greater good, even if it seems, because he's working with fallen man. He's looking for a thing that is fallen apart in many ways, and he's coming in and he's bringing order and whatnot. But even with your own story and others, it's like, why doesn't God just reveal himself right in the moment? Why doesn't God just take away this cancer right in the moment? Why doesn't God just do this in the moment? We have some friends that, they were going to church, and then they kind of started exploring a little bit. And it's like what you said about like letting people question and even argue with what they've been taught. So then they can really see, is this true? And so, I don't know, part of me is like, I think God, he would rather someone leave the faith, leave church, to then be able to really ask the questions so that when and if they find him, then it's real, if that makes sense. There's something, and there's a risk there. And again, it goes back, will God risk them going to hell to allow that to happen? But and the final thing I'll say on that, and I want to be able, if you have any questions too, I want to be able to jump on those, is like the ultimate desire, in my opinion, of God is for us to be one with him. And oneness comes through knowledge, it comes through knowing, it comes through experience, it comes through intimacy, it comes through history, it comes through all these things. Like the ultimate goal is not a bunch of robots, it's about his creation becoming one with him through eternity, where we're still separate in consciousness, but one, I guess, in vision or desire or something, in love, like, husband and wife coming together and becoming one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll pause there and let you either comment on that or any questions you may have.
Yeah, well, I just, the husband and wife coming together, I would reword that to spouses coming together, not to necessarily become one in this, biblical sort of theological sense, but more like this great team that can, raise decent kids, hopefully, can make the world a little bit better place. I look at this team that a married couple can do more than a single person can. And so that's why I really, marriage is a really important thing. And I don't deny that this building block of society, but, from my own experience growing up in a broken home, marriage wasn't necessarily a great thing in my particular circumstance with my parents. But you're using this kind of theological language but I agree with it pragmatically that, two people getting married do become one, but I can consider it this team. You kind of touched on, I think, Lee Strobel being an atheist. This is one of the reasons I'm like really clear. I do not want to represent myself as a believing Christian who then became an atheist, because I feel that is just this gimmick that is being portrayed. J. Warner Wallace does that. He's written this book, Cold Case Christianity, and he was this hardcore atheist, a dedicated, a committed atheist, I think he refers to himself. How do you become a committed atheist without really studying these issues? It just sounds like fraud to me and a gimmick. Lee Strobel, I think Josh McDowell, kind of the claim is that he set out to disprove the Bible and then ended up believing it and becoming a Christian. I don't want to say that that's his story, but definitely J. Warner Wallace's story is he was a committed atheist who researched these facts and, then became a committed Christian. I think that's a gimmick. You did say something about contradictions,
though.
Can
you expound more on that? Like, just I would like to know more about that. So, like a gimmick, as in, do you feel like they weren't like hardcore atheists? They were maybe minor atheists. They didn't really explore the topic, and then when they did, they like became Christian. Or could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes. Okay. So I'm looking at this as a genre of Christian apologetics. That there's a few of them out there, that have written books that talk about how researching Christianity led them from atheism to Christianity. And atheists do this too. There's plenty of atheists out there that were saying, I was a committed Christian, and then I became an atheist after really looking into the claim. So there's this genre of, change, dramatic change from religion to no religion, or from no religion to religion. And I'm really suspicious of this. And part of it is my law enforcement career. People tell me things and I'm automatically suspicious, but that's why I really represent myself as a very skeptical Christian, because I don't want to fit into that genre that I'm suspicious of. So my question's for J. Warner Wallace. I can't read his mind, but what do you mean by you were a committed atheist? That seems to be a definition of somebody who's really studied these issues and has made a conclusion that atheism is true. What do you mean by that? And I'm kind of wondering if he can explain that well. I'm thinking this is likely to be more of a marketing tool than it is an actual belief system. But that's speculation on my part. I'm speculating, right? But I would investigate that if I, had access to be able to ask J. Warner Wallace questions. That would be one of the things I would want to know. What do you mean by you were a committed atheist? Because I was just a kid, with no religious education, so I didn't have any real opinion on much of anything. But now I feel like
hyping it up a little bit more.
Hyping it up a little bit,
atheist they were.
right,
Okay.
and how much of a Christian they were and then became an atheist. So it's both.
Mm,
If we're looking
right.
at this as a sports analogy, both teams are doing it. And I just want to make sure that I'm trying to be as honest as I possibly can. That I was just more or less, a person with no real defined religious. I did become a Christian. I accepted Christ, but I can't say that I was never skeptical. I was always skeptical.
That's good. And I
So I
love
don't
your
know.
humility with that. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are my I'm not impressed when I hear I was an atheist who became a Christian, and I'm also not necessarily impressed with I was a Christian who became an atheist. Now, I don't want to side with the atheists, but maybe they have more evidence that they were in fact a Christian, as they attended church, they were volunteers in church. Some of them were actually pastors at churches, so that's more evidence they were actually a Christian than what J. Warner Wallace presents. He presents that he used to make fun of Christians as his big evidence that he was an atheist. Well, you could make fun. Islam makes fun of Christians, so that doesn't mean you don't believe in God. I don't know. I've rambled a little on that. I made my point. So
That's good. So what would you feel like, in your opinion? Because one thing I do want to note is, like, I really do love the humility you have about that. Like, because, sometimes you feel like, sometimes I encounter different people that are just like, there is no God.
yeah,
There's 0% chance there's God. I'm like, really? Like, I mean, for thousands of years we thought the universe was eternal, and now all the evidence the past 100 years about the Big Bang, and there's a starting point and all this stuff. Like, I mean, do you know everything? Like, and then they can flip that
yes.
around and say, well, how can you say there's a God? And I'm like, well, I mean, I know my wife exists. I don't know about other women out there, but I mean, I know my wife. I've experienced my wife. I mean, I could be wrong. This could be an hallucination. I could be in, a brain in a vat. There's always that possibility. I really
Sure.
believe I can't say 100% of anything, because I don't know 100% of everything. I could be
Yeah.
wrong with that statement, but I think there's truth in that. But because I've experienced my wife, because I know her, we've been married over 12 plus years, I can say with pretty strong confidence that she exists. Same thing with God. I believe he does, because of this experience I have with him on a daily basis. And again, maybe I'm wrong. But I do love the fact that you're willing to say you could be wrong, because I think all of us should say that. We could be wrong. None of us know.
Yeah.
But I would love to know, just in your opinion, because I'm sure this varies amongst agnostic, atheist, different people, even amongst Christians, what would make them disbelieve. But what do you feel in your heart would make you lean more towards, like, the belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he was crucified, buried, and rose to life on the third day? Like, what would be something that would help you in that that journey towards Jesus?
Yeah. Okay. It's a really good question. And this is where I think, the atheist community gets a bit hostile, and I think that question scares a lot of atheists in a way. And when people are acting under fear, they tend to act out a little bit aggressively. It's this fight or flight syndrome. You've asked them a question that creates a little bit of unease in them, and their natural body functions of dumping some adrenaline into their bloodstream, just goes on. But look at, I remember as a teenager and hearing just these vague reports of, born again Christian, you got to believe in Jesus, and little debates amongst teenagers who didn't know anything about what they were talking about. And, there's no evidence of this. There's no evidence of this. And if I heard teenagers talking about that now, I would politely, I wouldn't want to come off as the weird guy, but say, well, there's actually is evidence in favor of Jesus. The gospel stories is evidence. You can't just say that there's no evidence of it. It's whether there's reliable evidence of it, that there is evidence that God exists, and there is evidence that Jesus is God. That's in John's gospel. So to answer your question directly, if I believed that these stories were reasonably true, then yes, I would be a Christian. I would probably have some doubts. There would probably be big theological debates of, like, for instance, if I believe Jesus rose from the dead, I would be very focused on trying to figure out, what did Jesus want us to be like? And this, what would Jesus do, would be a very important question for me if I believed these stories had credibility. But then we would have a big argument, because I would be immediately saying, why is anybody listening to this Paul guy? I mean, he's not Jesus. He didn't rise from the, why are we listening to this guy? We should be figuring out what Jesus had to say. So that directly answers your question. If I believe these reports were reasonably true, then I would be a Christian. I don't
Mm.
believe they're true, though. You did mention contradictions, and everybody gets in these huge, long-winded arguments about contradictions. In law enforcement, we deal with contradictions all the time. People see things and they tell different stories about what they saw. I mean, usually the theme of the story is the same. There's not wild differences, but there can be nuanced differences all over the place with, people who watch a robbery, people who see a traffic accident. They will tell different stories, and this can actually be an evidence if you're reading the Gospels and there's some contradictions there. This could be evidence that they're actually truthful, because that is a natural thing that occurs
Mm.
in witness testimony. But sometimes we have significant law enforcement investigation. We have a significant contradiction, like one that's kind of problematic. Like, we really need to know what happened here in order to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. So we're going to have to go back and re-interview these witnesses. We're going to have to go back to the crime scene. We're going to have to try and figure out, why are these witnesses telling a difference? I have an actual case. I can very quickly go over this. So there was a murder. And I was a patrol sergeant at the time, responded to this murder. And, these are chaotic scenes. And I ended up interviewing about 4 children that were ages 10 to 12 years old, that were witnesses to this murder. It basically a man knocks on someone's door that he's got a beef with. That he knocks on the door. The victim comes outside. There's a confrontation outside, and the suspect shoots and kills the victim. Well, the girls were telling me, some of the girls were saying, well, he knocked on the window. And other girls were telling me he knocked on the door. And so, well, did he knock on the window or did he knock on the door? This is a contradiction, and we need to have the answer to this question. So we'll go back and looking at the crime scene. It was quite easy for us to figure this out. Some of the girls were in the bathroom and assumed that he knocked on the door because they couldn't see it. But he actually knocked on the window because other girls were in the living room and could see him physically knocking on the window. So this is a contradiction that's really not a contradiction at all. However, we couldn't.
Yeah,
it's people, seeing it from a different perspective, or hearing, some of them hearing it and assuming the natural thing that he knocked on the door, and others seeing it and realize, oh, it's just he knocked on the window. So a minor little case in point. However, what we could never do is try and make guesses as to why these girls were telling different stories about what happened. And unfortunately, with the Gospels, we can't go back and re-interview, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John to say, hey, why did you write this? There's these birth narratives look differently. What's going on here? Explain this. We have to speculate and guess. And therefore, we're ultimately ending up with, we don't really know what happened. So a contradiction, we're not sure. We have multiple stories that are possible. We don't know which one of them is actually true. That was maybe a little long-winded explanation, but my whole point is, speculating to resolve contradictions, to me, just means you don't know what actually happened. And you also have to consider that these guys are writing the same story from their own perspective and making up stuff. And they're making up different stuff. That's also possible. So when you speculate, you open this door to, everything's possible, because you don't know. If you don't know, well, then everything's possible. But in this case of the murder, well, we had a really good understanding of why these 2 stories about the suspect, and not that it really mattered, though. So sometimes the contradiction doesn't really matter. We have overwhelming evidence that the suspect shot the victim. So even if we weren't able to resolve that contradiction, it wouldn't have mattered in the overall case.
So for you, it's really the stories. Like, are the stories valid? Are they truthful stories? Or if there may be certain areas that, I don't know, were not correct, is the main part real? That Jesus was he really killed, first off, and then was he really crucified? And was he really buried? And did he really rise to life and appear?
Yeah. So, I don't want, some contradictions don't matter. They don't matter. The whole thing of Jesus having a ministry, being crucified, stories of him raising from the dead, I think are true. That there were stories of it. Whether he actually rose from the dead is something that I don't believe. Actually, I would say I don't believe that happened. But again, could potentially be wrong about that. So, but I don't believe that happened. And I'm relating, there's other things in the Bible that go, well, this didn't happen, this didn't happen. So you have this long line of things that didn't happen, in my view. Therefore, it's, if one thing in the Bible is not true, it's possible other things in the Bible are not true. So, yeah, contradictions are a little bit interesting too. I think too much is being made of contradictions, and actually, some of the problems with the Synoptic Gospels is actually they're actually too similar. I mean, to me, it's quite clear that they're copying one another, that they're not really getting information from witnesses and talking to people and investigating this like a detective would. They're actually just getting somebody's report and copying that down and then changing it for their own theological or personal, view that they're trying to portray. So that's a lot of talking on my part, but those are just some of my feelings, no notes off the top of my head kind of thing.
Yeah. I guess I still want to keep going down that line. Like, it
Sure.
sounds like to me, if you knew the documents, the truth of what was in the documents and such, then you would be able to say, okay, well, then I do believe. I believe in Jesus then. Now you can figure out, okay, what does that entail for you personally?
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's any... I'm curious, like, what would help, like, whether it was, I don't know, some sort of lost manuscript we found, kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that helped a lot of people at least
Mm-hmm.
have more faith in the Old Testament. The fact that Isaiah is so similar. I think the man I was listening to was saying it's almost identical, or maybe there's certain things. But the fact that that was what BC, and that's pretty neat. Now you could argue and say, well, it's still just, you could say it's fictional literature or whatever, but there's still, it kind of adds another piece of evidence that at least the Bible has been the same in many ways, at least Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
But for you, would it be more of kind of that scholarly information, the historical, the ancient findings and such, or would it be the experience, or would both help? Like some people, I'll just touch on that real quick. Like for me, I like both, but the experiences were really got my attention. I don't know where I'd be right now today.
Mm-hmm.
I love having the historical. I love having the apologetic parts. I love having that. That helps my faith, but it's like that experience in my room and further experiences. I didn't even talk about my leg getting healed. I had a shorter leg than my left leg. My right leg was about 1/4 of an inch shorter, and
Yeah.
which messed my back up. I mean, I had
Yeah.
crazy
Right.
back pain. I would play football, lacrosse, and if I didn't wear that heel pad, a custom heel pad on my right shoe at all times, if I didn't have it there for more than a day, my back would just
Mm-hmm.
kill me. If I wore
Yeah.
sandals for more than a day,
Mm-hmm.
and this was early in my faith, and this is when I was like, I believed in Jesus, but I didn't know much. And I went to a church. It was cool. It was fun. It was like a men's God encounter thing. And I was like, oh, this is nice. And I went up front to get prayer, and I did not go up to get prayer for my leg. I went up to get prayer for thoughts, because at that time I was really battling sexual thoughts, negative thoughts. And the
Yeah.
guy like kind of bypassed that. Is like, how are you doing? Like, are you unbalanced? And you can't really tell too much that my leg is shorter. And I was like, well, my right leg's shorter than my left. And he's like, well, let's get that fixed right now in Jesus' name. I don't even know the guy's name. I don't know. He wasn't the main pastor. I don't know who he was. And he prayed for me. My legs went up. Like, I sat down. My right leg went numb in a good way as he's praying. Like, he's not yanking or pulling. I did chiropractic and acupuncture and all that. It
Yeah.
didn't make it stick, the healing. And I remember being there. I'm like, what's happening right now? Like, what's going on? Like, because I'm feeling my right leg, and I'm like, is this mental? Whatever. Like, my right leg is going numb, but it's a nice numb. And he's like, in Jesus' name, leg grow out. And I'm sure you've seen videos like that online and stuff. I know people, even Christians, try to disprove them. But I'm there, I'm looking, and I'm seeing this happen. I'm seeing something happen with my leg. He's not yanking or pulling. And then I get up, and my back feels healed. I take the heel pad out. They measure my legs. They're the same. People are watching this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'm healed. And I haven't worn my heel pad since. Like, it's been 10 years. And I know things can happen. I know that people have a certain, I'm like, so right there, that was like another piece of evidence of like, okay, something just happened to my physical body that I'd had for years. And so I don't know. I'm curious just for you. So for me, experience is big, which I know a lot of Christians don't prefer. Like, they don't want to rely on experience. I like both, but experience has been really big in my faith journey with the Lord and really believing
Right.
He's the Lord. But so yeah,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts about all that? Like, what do you kind of lean more towards if you had the experience, or like you want both, or yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, very good. So, these stories of personal experiences, I'm not a guy who discounts these because these are people that I can ask questions about it. I've never had that myself. To me, for whatever reason, I've prayed for Jesus to come into my heart, to learn about Jesus and this kind of thing. I didn't get any experience like that. So to me, it was a little bit like a negative data point, not so much that Christianity is true, but definitely a negative data point that the person that was telling me that Jesus would make himself known, would come into my life, would radically change my life. It definitely lowered their credibility when I prayed for these things to happen, because people told me that. And yeah, I determined, hey, that guy was wrong. So I'm very skeptical when especially a professional Christian apologist is making these types of arguments, but most of them don't actually make those arguments. That those are arguments you hear from individual Christians, that the professional apologists want to know you have good evidence to believe this, that these reports are accurate or reasonably accurate. I don't demand that. I've written thousands of police reports, right? There's mistakes in a lot of those police reports. The fact of the matter is, I've made mistakes. I've never lied in a police report, but I know I've made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes come out in court, and that's why you're, oh man, I kind of messed that up. So I'm aware. So I don't demand. That doesn't mean that the suspect is innocent of the crime that they're accused of. It does, in the jury's mind, maybe create some doubts. There's reasonable, maybe even reasonable doubts. Hey, the cops screwed something up. Well, what else did they screw up? So the reports don't need to be perfect, and they're not perfect. I think it's, you don't sound like a fundamentalist, that you're open to the idea that these authors may have made some mistakes in writing down, these stories. If Christianity is true, God is, kind of divinely influencing what they're writing, but they still could have written some mistakes in there. So I'm not demanding perfection in these reports. I'm demanding reasonable accuracy. There's books written on why I don't think they're reasonably accurate. Now, what we read in our Bible today could be reasonably accurate to the original documents written by whoever wrote them. But my foundation is that the people who wrote these stories were not at these scenes that they pretend to report. And even then, the contradictions are a problem to me. Some of them are very significant. But even if you read the stories themselves, it does seem like Jesus' own apostles are doubting his resurrection. I've got some comments on this, but why does nobody talk about that? Matthew 28:17, some of the 11 apostles are doubting that that Jesus is here on this mountain in Galilee. And then in Luke chapter 24, you have this appearance in Jerusalem in the house. And it literally says, Luke's gospel literally says they didn't believe it. So how is it that we're getting, Jesus' apostles believing in his resurrection when the report written by Luke, now it says because of joy and amazement. So why does it say that? Well, I mean, the Christian view would be they were overjoyed at seeing Jesus. It was the first appearance. They're going to be confused. And I could say, yes, but you could easily interpret that as they saw Jesus' ghost, because it says they saw Jesus' ghost, that the ghost talked to them and that they were experiencing this ghost, and they became overjoyed and amazed. But at the end of the day, they didn't believe that that was actually Jesus. They thought that that was Jesus's ghost. And that's also very consistent with Luke's report on this kind of thing. So there's all this stuff in there. But no, I don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were at these scenes or saw these things or even had good information I think they were making stuff up based on some truths, though. I'm not a mythicist. I mean, Jesus was a real person. He had a real ministry. It's incredibly likely that he ran afoul of the Romans and they crucified him. It gets a little vague after that. I really do think Christianity is a religion made up for profit and prestige, and now it's currently being used for some people to get wealthy off of. It's got political, overtones to it. It's being used for what a wide variety of people want to use it for a wide variety of topics. So religion is oftentimes that. It's actually more political than it is theological for a lot of people. Those are just kind of my views. I don't think these reports have credibility as far as eyewitness testimony. We hear that. To a retired police officer, that's a nonsensical statement. Eyewitness testimony is a living, breathing human being that answers questions about what they saw. And, we just simply don't have that. We have reports. of eyewitness testimony, and even that's controversial. We have hearsay reports of what is probably not the statements of anybody. They're the oral traditions being written down, and for the purposes of convincing people it's true. So I got a little long-winded on that.
No, that's good.
That's very broad, and you really these conversations in detail get down into the weeds as to why do I not think John was at the present. I don't think he was present in any of these reports. And, from chapter 19 on, he's making stuff up based on oral traditions. I would say he even identifies himself as not being present in his use of the first person versus his common use of the third person. But those are really discussions that whole books could be written on. So, we're not resolving that today. Those are just a broad vision, broad ideas of why I don't believe the reports are credible.
That's good. And I have a question for you kind of on that. But one thing I will comment on that, I personally, it kind of goes back to seeing God's interaction with man, interaction with people, that I've learned to appreciate more and more as I begin to realize how complicated and complex the universe is. Interactions are cause and effect that can go on for, billions of different encounters and such. But one thing I do, and that's one thing I've struggled with at times, is it seems like they're talking about two different things here, like in the Garden of Gethsemane or here and different stuff. And I know apologists have different answers for that and whatnot. But for me, I'm like, it's so interesting that personally for me, in my opinion, that God would orchestrate this and allow certain things to be in, or even how it was portrayed. And maybe there's a super wonderful answer for why. Maybe in heaven we see, oh, that's why, okay. But for me too, I always see God provides evidence, provides a level of evidence, but then he still gives room for people to have faith and believe. Even though I had that encounter with my leg, that was for me a clear miracle. I just don't know of any other reason why. And even now how it's still healed, I'm but I would then still have doubts. I would say okay, well, what? And even now, 10 years later, even though I feel more than ever my faith secure in the Lord, my love for the Bible, my love for people. I went through a season where I was listening to Bart Ehrman. And you've heard of Bart, of course, right?
Yeah, I've read his books. I think he's too focused on contradictions sometimes would be my, little pushback. But
yeah,
he can actually stimulate people, Christian or non-Christians, to stimulate their interest in the New Testament because it is fascinating documents. I mean, this, people who say, "Oh, this is dumb and boring." Okay, but I get it. That's just because you haven't had time to really look into this, and that's fine. But no, these documents are fascinating, and he has the ability to kind of open that door for people, I think.
Right, and the one thing too, it's so I went through a season, and I started experiencing some doubts. I'm whoa, he's bringing up some major things. He's bringing a sword, and he's smashing these Christians in many different ways, and so. It was neat going through that season of listening to his debates and coming out being you know what? I still believe in there's something beyond even with that, I'm okay. And I don't know. And someone could say, well, that's blind faith. That's blind this. But for me, I'm it's interesting because the Bible says it's impossible to please God without faith. At the end of the day, I mean, he can, even if it's true, which I believe it is true, the New Testament, these miracles happening and stuff, the resurrection, and they're still doubting. It's there at some degree, the Lord still allows this opportunity for people to doubt or to leave. I don't know if you've read Narnia with your children or anything like that, but my children love Narnia. And one of the main characters is Susan. She goes to Narnia, three times, something like that, maybe two. And has all these experiences in Narnia. And in the last, and I may be ruining this for anyone watching this now, but it's in the end, she's not in Narnia because she doesn't believe it anymore. She thinks those fairy tales, she thinks those stories they did as a kid. And the rest of the children believe, they go to Narnia and all that stuff in the final book, and it's great, it's wonderful. But I'm that's a beautiful picture, people that I've known that have had encounters with God, that have seen the truth and all these different things, and then just kind of forgetting. And so it's interesting. It's I look at faith as, I don't know if you want to call it a plant or a tree or something that you do need to feed. Like you can't just rely on yesterday's bread or yesterday's water or whatever. It's something to grow and to cultivate. And God still allows the opportunity for doubt and questioning. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then the question I had, where did it go? I had it in my head and then it
Yeah, that's why I write
disappeared.
everything down. It gets worse as you get older. You really need to write things down.
Well, it was along those lines. It was okay. We're talking Berman, but if it comes back, I'll bring it up to you. But yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we have faith in even minor things. When you get in the car and you have some level of faith that your car is going to start, because it doesn't always start, not 100% of the time, but generally it's going to start. So we have faith that our car is going to start. So these arguments, to me, I don't want to discount that Christianity does need some faith, and I think that's a healthy way of explaining it. It's just how much faith, where are you at? For me, it would be too much faith and not enough practical reasons to believe in truth. Whereas you might have, practical reasons. Your own personal experience is part of your belief system. It sounds like to me, is the way I'm interpreting what you're saying. So I don't have that. So that's not mine. I've looked into just a few of these miracle claims and not been terribly impressed by them. So, it doesn't really provide me. I'm much more of a looking at the stories of Christianity and looking at these as reports. And are these reports reliable? If I felt they were reliable, then I would be a Christian, because that evidence, I would still need some faith. But also, if my car never started, I wouldn't have the faith that it would start. Or if it was been sitting for 5 years, I wouldn't have a lot of faith that it would start. And so I'm at, that these aren't really all that credible.
I do have the question now. It came back.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, go for it. Let's do this.
I was just curious
before you forget again.
From your standpoint. So I know you mentioned maybe it was for personal benefit or personal wealth or whatever it was, like people writing these documents and whatnot. What are your thoughts of the intentionality of these individuals, and then even the early Christians, a lot of them being martyred and persecuted and such, and holding on to this faith, and even current day, China, North Korea, Iraq, and we even talk about which I'm very interested more in, even the skeptic, why so many Muslims are having these experiences with the man in white, and this man saying that he's Isa, he's Jesus. I even know one man from Pakistan whose roommate had 2 different dreams with Jesus, and the man did not believe until Jesus would heal his sister. His sister was sick. I'm like, this guy had 2 different dreams. But there's people that never even heard about the gospel having these encounters. But again, that's a separate thing. But what are your thoughts about that? The early Christians being martyred, persecuted, putting so much on the line for this, and even writing these accounts. What do you feel propelled them to do that?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to deny that there was some persecution going on. This is one of the things where I think Bart Ehrman has made a point. You kind of mentioned me, even he was, swinging this axe to. Bart Ehrman makes the gospel stories very interesting, because he says stuff about them that I didn't know about. And then I go and I read it and go, I think he's right about that. Look at what it says here. So I can match up what he's saying and what his books say to the stories themselves. And that makes things very interesting. But one of the other things he's done is take these common Christian apologetics that we hear from people, and he's really smashed those up, saying, this idea that the apostles were martyred, proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus, simply can't be demonstrated. That's an exaggeration. Yet there's a lot of Christians going around saying that the apostles would not have died for a lie. They were in a position to know whether Jesus actually rose from the dead or not. And they went to their deaths, proclaiming the resurrection of Christ, the divinity of Christ. And it's a very simple question to ask them. Where does it say that? Show me that. And they can't demonstrate it. And then they have to use this really wide patchwork of apocryphal, documents from later periods in time, documents that were specifically rejected from being in the Bible. And they don't, even those documents don't support the claim that the apostles died because they were claiming the resurrection of Jesus. So to me, this, whenever I hear somebody say this, immediately my thoughts are, okay, this is a person who's been duped into believing the apostles died for their faith. They've been duped by, dishonest apologists who are promoting this stuff, and you can't demonstrate it. So I hear that, and I think it's a real negative because I've done some research on that. I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question. You also kind of vaguely alluded to, you were talking about, these tragedies that we see. I was in law enforcement, so I've seen my fair share of tragedies. And just the animal kingdom alone is this incredibly violent thing, which makes sense from the process of evolution through natural selection, that creatures would evolve over deep time to survive, not necessarily to be good creatures. And we're part of that evolutionary process. So that makes perfect sense why we would see cruelty in the world, where a divine loving God kind of, it's a data point of evidence against a divine, all-powerful, loving God. And then I ask myself, well, why do we see all this cruelty? How do we explain this? And the Christian view is, well, we might not know, but there could be a better purpose for all this. And I also think, well, it's also true that we see this because there is no God, and nature just simply doesn't care about all the cruelty going on. And that better fits the evidence that we actually can look at and see when we see tragedy. We're experiencing that right now here in California. 25 people, or more than 25 people, lost their lives within a very short period of time because of these firestorms that we've had. And they've lost their homes. And, why would God allow this to happen? Well, because there is no God, and the firestorms and nature that's blowing, these embers for, a half mile and lighting more and more dry brush because we live in a desert. It doesn't care about any of the tragedy that these firestorms have caused. That also really, to me, fits the evidence quite well.
Yeah, and those are good
So
points.
I don't know. Those are my touching on points. And, when I hear this, I really advise Christian. I think some apologists are realizing, hey, we need to revamp that whole argument. And Trent Horn is a guy who does, I think, a pretty good job being pragmatic, looking at it from an evidence-based belief system as opposed to a personal experience. And he's out there saying, I think Josh McDowell is another person saying, hey, we've exaggerated that claim. We can't actually demonstrate that. So now the new claim, since the old claim no longer works, the new claim is well, the apostles were very, very sincere about their faith. That's kind of the new apologetics. So these apologetics change because the skeptical community also studies the Bible. And they come in and they basically say, what you're saying isn't true, and these are the reasons why it's not true. And then the apologetic community goes, you actually have some pretty good points there, so we'll change our argument. So that's unimpressive to me. That's unimpressive. That's people trying to change looking at the evidence and trying to create an argument that fits the evidence, like trying to stick a square peg into a round hole. I think that goes on a little bit more. That's one of my reasons for skepticism.
That's why it's so good to have that, to have the debates, to have the pushback and the challenges, so that even both sides can't just start saying something because the other side is going to challenge it, and then you get. That's why I went through a time where I listened to over 130 debates. It was during that time I listened to Bart Ehrman too. But amongst atheists, Christians, and Jehovah's Witness, and Agnostic, and all this stuff. And it's powerful because you can see the weak points, and then you can see the strong points. You can see both, and and I think more and more people, they would find a lot of value in that, like hearing just two people go at it, hopefully in a respectful, honorable way. And to be able to hear both sides and hear why, because then you can leave and say, okay, I can see why. Like even after this conversation, I can see more why. Okay, I can see why you lean towards atheism. And maybe you see more why I lean more towards Jesus and Christianity and such, And these are good points. And a lot of them, so there's so many different areas you can go. And personally for me, I love it. And again, I think it's I also don't want to get too lax, just to be real. It's like my wife and I were in this place now. Like I preach, I do my videos, I preach the gospel, point people to Jesus, and trust that God will do the rest.
Yeah.
And before I've done more intense, like on Facebook and messaging people and saying, you got to repent or you're going to go to hell. You got to get right with God. And these things can help. I remember going downtown, and this is when I was on my journey, I already had my encounter with the Lord. And I was sleeping around my girlfriend. I was still doing drugs. And I saw some guys on the street corner, and they had a big old sign saying, if you do any of these sins, you're going to hell. And a lot of people would laugh at them and stuff. And I'm like, whoa, I'm doing like 5 of those sins. Like, and it touched me. I'm like, okay, am I really living this up? Like I part of me too in my journey, that's why I'm kind of a unique Christian, is I look at it from different standpoints. Okay, because I lean toward, I like to be simple. I believe in a young earth. I believe in these things. I could be wrong. I'm open to that. If the universe is billions of years, that's fine. If, God can work with that. If macroevolution is true, okay. It's like I can see, even at the very least, that these other things are true. Like there's something behind the scenes, this conscious mind leading us and trying to direct us in a certain way where there's negatives, there's positives and such. But ultimately, I like to hold to the basic view. Yeah, I believe the Bible. I believe these things. But I think it's good. I think conversations like this is really good. I've enjoyed it. I think, I really like you as an individual too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you sound like a guy I would really get along well with. You're at a different stage in life than I am, though. I mean, you're raising a family. I mean, to me, that has to be your focus at this particular point. And I'm
big focus.
I'm hanging out with my grandkids, sometimes and enjoying them, but I'm not responsible. I feel I'm responsible to help raise them, like to teach them some valuable lessons. But I'm not raising them. I'm enjoying them. So that's a totally different stage than what you're at. You're actually responsible for these little persons to develop.
That's good. But I really honor the fact that your openness, and it's not just a staunch closed book atheism or whatever. It's like you really do want to know the truth, and you're open. You even prayed, So and for me personally, like I think, I don't know. I don't know what your story holds in the days to come. I don't know what my story holds in the days to come.
Right.
But I like to believe that as long as someone's humble, as someone's open, and they're always searching, it's like what Jesus said, if you knock, if you seek, if you ask, you'll find. How and when, that's the big question. It's like, how long does that take? Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's longer, and whatever it is, I feel like even if someone doesn't come to the realization, and I gotta go back to the fact, I don't necessarily believe that people that have never heard the gospel can go to hell. I don't believe in multiple ways to heaven. I believe Jesus is the way. However, at the same time, I also believe he's good. He's going to look and judge people individually based on their circumstances, what they were taught, what they were given, their mental capabilities, right, whatnot. But at the end of the day, I feel like humility is one of the greatest things, like a true humility in openness that would be very difficult for God to damn when someone really is just like, hey, I'm looking, I'm open. And even for me personally, if I'm disproved, whatever, I want to have that heart openness to the truth, because if he is true and he is alive, then he's going to continue to lead me in this direction. So yeah, I really appreciate you in this conversation. And yeah, anything you want to share, where people can find you and learn more about your content and such.
Yeah, so I have a very small YouTube channel, very small. I'm not like somebody out there with thousands and thousands of subscribers. I think, I don't know, Alex O'Connor, I believe, just hit 1 million subscribers. I'm never going to be anything like that. I just maybe put out some video once every 6 weeks. But I've kind of got a corny name based on my law enforcement career, Sergeant Skeptic on YouTube. And
it's a good name.
Some of my, well, I think it's actually a little corny, but it's what I came up with, and I put out some things on my ideas. And I'm looking at this kind of like these stories in the New Testament are reports. and why I don't find them to be trustworthy reports. And then there's a smattering of other things. I just put out a video that very few people even watched, like 300 people or something, on the, a comprehensive view on the moral argument for God and why that's not a good argument. And I have these 5 different ways it's not. So yeah, that's where you could find me if you're interested in my views. And if anybody's got a connection to J. Warner Wallace, I'd love to debate him about these issues, in more of a formal setting. I think he's a very well-known person. I do recommend his book for people who are just starting out on this journey, but I would also recommend his book with a real fair amount of caution that, hey, a lot of the things he says, some well-read skeptic is really going to refute that. Maybe even really effectively. But at any rate, that's where people could find me if they're interested.
Oh, nice. Well, I appreciate the conversation, Dana. Maybe we'll do it again.
All right. Well, I appreciate it as well. I do have to kind of get going, and I think you might have to get going as well. So we'll sign off for now. But thanks for your time. I guess it's this afternoon for you. It's the morning for me. And yeah, have a great day.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dana. You too.